Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings, Daniel. It's great to have you on the podcast show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Before we go into some of the work that you've been doing, I do like to ask all of my guests something about their origin story. What did you study at college? Was it inevitable you'd end up in the field that you're in now, in academia and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think there was a ton of order in my my origin story. I thought I wanted to be a virologist when I first came to undergrad. I started studying. I took a virology seminar actually as a freshman, which is kind of a special thing I get to do. And I was more interested in, what a pandemic might do to the economy at the time. So
when was this?
That was about 2006, I think, fall 2006.
Okay. It's quite prescient.
Yeah. And yeah, I think the professor who was teaching me at the time, he said, you may want to go take some more classes at the economics department. And I already knew I liked economics. So, yeah, that was, I moved into econ and math at that point from biology. And then from econ and math, I ended up transferring into the business school to get more of an applied econ look. Yeah, I mean, I had a whole bunch of topics I fell in love with. I went and traded for a few years. The reason
what was that experience like, trading?
Oh, it was very interesting. Traders kind of learn to pick up tidbits of information from all over the place and try to synthesize them all at once. So listening to, how people thought about risk and kind of they didn't put it this way, but thinking in bets, I think it was very influential in terms of how I look at things now, a little bit more probabilistically. Honestly, the reason I thought it'd be a cool place to work, though, is, on the interview day, there was a guy in like a banana suit dancing around to Ace of Base. And when I asked them why they were doing that, he said, well, we don't know, but we're long. And whenever we're long and he dances like this, the market rallies, so he can't stop till we get out of the position.
Like a lucky mascot almost.
Yeah. So, I mean, not the best reason to pick an employer, if it works out, but I got the offer. I had a really great time there, good experience. Yeah. And then after that, there were a few things where I realized I kind of needed to learn how to do, how to answer my own questions. So I went back to graduate school and I just kind of started to really enjoy academia. So here I am now.
That's great. And your academic sort of field of focus, so to speak, or expertise is the economic effects of digital technologies. So why did you pick that area?
Well, partly because of what I had seen in undergrad. I guess the classes I enjoyed most were talking about how the economics of digital goods and services were very different than ordinary economics. That was one piece, but then the other piece was seeing it firsthand. When I was effectively like an algorithmic bus driver for a big trading system. You could see very quickly how much technology changes what trading was like. So I thought, well, what if it does this to the whole economy? What should we be understanding differently? And I had no idea how to pursue those questions given the skill set I had at the time. So, then I remember there was an argument at a seminar when I was first year graduate student about how soon self-driving cars would show up. And there were a lot of smart people in the room, and some people said 5 years and some people said 40. And I thought, well, this is a good research question. If people this brilliant can disagree about how it's going to happen, maybe I should do some work to try to figure it out.
And just out of interest, do you have an answer?
No, I never figured that
one. Understood. Now, in terms of digital technologies, one thing that we had over the pandemic was the lockdown, work from home. Everyone started to use Zoom and other video technologies, and
right.
The lockdowns have lifted now. I mean, has the whole COVID lockdown story, has that sort of structurally impacted the way people work now, or was that a temporary impact?
No, I think the work. We've done a little bit of this, but my co-authors and I, but the work by Nick Bloom and his team at Stanford and other places, just looking at how work patterns have changed, I think some component of work from home is definitely going to stick around. I I don't think it's going to be able to fully go away, even if people want to kind of return to office. And there are trade-offs with work from home. Like it seems like there are certain things that are easier, certain things that are harder. Accessing talent markets across the country and the world much easier. Um, on the other hand, building up training programs for younger employees who are just starting out their career, that might be a little bit more difficult if people are fully remote. So, um, I expect it's another option now, and I expect like longer term probably contributes positively to productivity. Um, but I do think, at least in my own experience, I've seen that there are some pretty serious downsides. It's harder to build a community around, an employer if you've got everybody working from home.
Yeah. And you mentioned productivity, and this has been one of the sort of enduring challenges in economics, trying to understand why productivity has been so weak in the last 3-4 decades, despite all of this tech revolutions that we've had from the PC, internet, and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I should start off by saying that productivity, at least total factor productivity, is more a measure of what we don't know than what we do, or it's been called a measure of our ignorance, right? So you start off with GDP growth, and then you subtract off the growth in labor hours times the labor share of income, and then you subtract off the growth in capital service flows times capital's share of income, and then what you're left with is this residual thing, and that's total factor of productivity. So there are good reasons to use that approach, but it's it's economically sound if you have a production function of the standard set of assumptions. Under the standard set of assumptions, this does return some sort of who knows what magic beans in the economy and how quickly they're growing to make this more productive. So whenever we try to interpret that number, we're left a little bit of a challenge to try to figure out where it comes from. So there's like towards the end of the 80s, Bob Solow said you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. That quote, sort of famously negatively predict. I don't know what the word would be, but it pretty much showed up like a couple of years later, and we had a boom in productivity up until about 2005, and then it went away. So after that, we got roughly 15 years of stagnation until COVID, 15, 17 years of stagnation, where we were around 1.5%, a little less than 2% productivity growth on average, which is definitely concerning. But if you look with a longer historical perspective, like the post-war to 1970s, you had much faster productivity growth in the 70s up until the computer revolution. You had slower productivity growth. So I'm not totally sure why these things kind of ebb and flow, but I think we're at the precipice with all these different disruptions to the economy. There's, I think, many opportunities to do things differently than we were before. Of course, we could always do things similarly to the way we were doing before. So I'm optimistic about productivity growth going forward. But there's many things about the measure itself that leave much to be desired. We don't handle intangibles well. In tight labor markets, you're pulling in lower marginal productivity workers to do the same job. So it seems like productivity is lower, but that's because you're trying to get more people employed. Like these aren't necessarily bad things, but I think the long-term trend, especially with new technologies, could be very good. We'll see, but I'm also not one of these people that thinks that we're going to get like 10% productivity growth per year. I would be very excited to see an extra 0.5 to 1.5% annually.
I think that's like a true economist there.
Right.
Measured. Yeah, exactly. You mentioned intangible assets, and then earlier you talked about digital goods. I mean, could you sort of define some of these terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So a digital good, I mean, something that can be digitized is something that can be stored as information, as ones or zeros. So that's everything from information that we consume, like a movie or something, to information that can help us change our decisions and make better ones. And then in the latter context, information is valuable if it can help you make a better decision. So that leads to lots of different interesting dynamics. One of which is kind of fun. Like if you're selling data, it's very difficult for a few reasons. One is, the arrow paradox. You don't know what it's worth until I give it to you, but once you've seen it, then you no longer need to pay for it. So information markets are hard to create. That doesn't mean they don't exist. There are ways around that. Like, I don't know, the newspapers in France, you don't know exactly what they're going to report on every day, but you can trust that they're going to report on things that, probably cover what your interests are and so on. So that, digital good generally just something that can be converted into bits. Then intangible goods, those are sort of, it's a little harder to, it's an intangible, right? It's harder to define. But rather than, machinery or buildings, intangibles, historically have been things like IP, patents, brands, goodwill. If you buy a company, then, pay more than book value, and the rest is goodwill. But concretely, what does an intangible tend to look like? Well, it's, how you do things, or culture, or training, or, human capital, things that live in people's heads that you don't really own, because they could walk out the door with it at any time, but, you employ people to do it. So like, one thing that is it's been an idea I've been batting around for a while, right? Like, salaries are kind of like debt in a world where intangible assets and human capital are more important, right? So the traditional finance models, or capital structure models, they suggest that labor markets are perfectly flexible. You can tune up or tune down your labor force however you'd like. In practice, that's obviously never been the case, but it ignores what people know and how important that is to business function. So if you reconceptualize human capital as being something that's like critical to the operations of the company, then, senior to all of your debt payments are paying your people. You might have a little bit of wiggle room there, but it looks more like, if you decided you weren't going to keep your workforce around and they walked, then your business would die. That sounds a lot like debt to me. But it's a real version of debt, in a sense. Like, it's not just that you can refinance it; you need those people, because they're the ones who make everything function. So, this whole mix of all these different things, know-how, training, business processes, even having the IT person know how to get you to reboot your computer, so that it functions properly. These sorts of things are all intangibles, and they're critically important. The majority of firms have like a massive chunk of their value driven by these intangible assets now.
And is there a way to measure this in some way, or how does this get reported in the economic data, or where does it sort of appear somewhere?
Right. It depends. So it depends which data set you're looking at. The government has started measuring some of these things. If you go look at the BEA fixed asset tables, they've got stuff like IP in there, and software and so on. I think in other cases, so this human capital question, or this culture value question, this sort of stuff, you have to try to look for something that's tied or highly complementary to that intangible asset, and track it over time. So there's sort of the level where if you can pin the level at some point, then you can track its growth over time. So like, one of the things we do in our work, we want to write this is a paper with Sunny Tambay, Lauren Hitt, and Eric Rielfsen. We call it digital capital. So to track digital capital and measure it, which is, in some cases, 25% of the value of firms. What we do is we look for software engineers or software talent, IT people, that sort of thing. And then we track how much those worker counts change over time. We use LinkedIn data to do this. We partnered with the LinkedIn Economic Graph Research and Insights team. They were great. So they provide us with this panel at the firm level of like all the different types of people that are employed at a company. And we can watch and see, okay, how does that employment change over time, knowing that you only hire software engineers if you've got business processes in place to make them productive. And by tracking that growth, you can use something called the quantity revelation theorem. It gives you the two equations that you can use to pin down what the level of this intangible hidden stuff is. That's from a paper in 2001 by Bob Hall. It's often neglected, but I think it's a wonderful paper.
Okay. And then what's if we think about things in terms of intangible assets versus tangible assets, What's the
Mhm.
benefit of thinking about intangible assets? I mean, what does that bring to the table that tangible assets doesn't, or how does it behave differently?
Right, right. So again, it depends on your question, but let's take one which is like marketing assets, right? Like you're trying to buy or sell, assets with a tractor or something or a building, right? Like you can set up a market for that. It's not too bad to do. With buildings, you can, tractors are commodified, so it's going to be the same tractor every time, unless it's used or something. There may be slight differences. With a building, you might be able to sell pieces of it, like an apartment. How do you sell a company's culture? That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. You basically have to buy or sell the entire company. So in terms of collateralizing those assets, financing them, there's a whole bunch of enormous challenges that come with that. Another way where it ends up being valuable, I mean, first of all, it's helpful for understanding what the drivers of value in our sort of digital services based economy, um, might be. But so say you're trading, right, and you want to look at value versus growth as a possible style, right? Historically, I guess this is like an ongoing debate amongst people: is value as a factor dead and so on? Maybe not, but maybe it's that our accounting system for how we figure out what value is, maybe that's not appropriate anymore. Like because we're looking for assets that are tangible, which show up on the book value, in book values. It may be that you're looking for discounted intangible assets now, and that's harder to find, but it'll show up as a growth like stock. If I haven't run the numbers on this, but it's possible that like Apple is actually a value stock if you account for the discount in their intangibles or something. Um, or there may be some value stocks that surprise us. So that's another place on the investing side where things might be pretty interesting. Now, in my own work, where is that useful? Well, we wanted to answer kind of definitively where does this question of like the computers are everywhere, but in the productivity statistics thing come from? So we defined this idea called the productivity J curve, which is to say, you know, you start off with a brand new technology. If you have a new technology that's super impactful and changes a lot at once, something like what we think AI might be, um, then it's not enough to just nibble around the edges. You're going to have to kind of gut what you were doing and transform it and then come out the other side with a new business process. And this is really expensive and it takes a long time. This happened with electrification, with the steam engine. With electrification, they started off putting gigantic electric dynamos in the middle of the factory floor, replacing the steam engine. And it wasn't for 30 years that they figured out, okay, you could put like little motors where all the machines used to be to power every individual line or something in a factory. So, you know, you could see similar kinds of lags. We're still figuring out where to use computers. So if you've got that, and you got this process in the beginning where we have to do this really large buildup of intangible assets before we even start getting the gains. In the beginning, it looks like you're putting a lot in, a lot of tangible stuff, money, time, effort, machines. You're putting a lot of things in to get less out. But it's because you're building up this hidden intangible asset. There's a capital accumulation process happening. And then later, so that's a big investment upfront, right? So it's a drag on productivity potential. And then later, as that thing you built up starts to actually yield, returns, it looks like you're getting something tangible on the other side for free. But really, that's not the case. You made an investment and it's starting to pay off. Now, the market's not stupid. That investors figure this out. They see money coming for free, they price assets properly, and so on. But I think when it comes to our measurements, we kind of assume that there's some steady state thing, and measured productivity growth can actually be wrong for quite a while if we don't account for these dynamics. So we proposed a way of measuring the intangibles and then backing into the calculation of how much of this intangible growth is happening on the side that might be creating a drag on productivity growth. That leads to, that's you can adjust things and you can take the rosier view of things that productivity growth is actually better than we think. Or you can say, well, that means the productivity slowdown since 2005 is actually much bigger than we think too. So, because there are all sorts of intangible assets being created then that aren't being created now.
Okay.
So it's
And in terms of the lag, the time lag between some kind of new technology and then before it sort of feeds through eventually to productivity,
right.
how, what is that time lag, or is there a way to estimate that in some way?
Well, just like monetary policy transmission, long and variable lags, right? I think it's different for every technology. It depends how impactful it is. It depends what kinds of work it changes, what kinds of capital it enables. Um, I think, and if you take a very long view, right, like it could be many, many decades. I don't think um, computers writ large. I don't think we're done with that one, and we started it in the 70s.
Yeah,
So
understood. And you've done a lot of work on AI and its impact on the labor market. I mean, maybe that's one way we can sort of understand how it's going to spread through the economy. I mean,
right.
which sectors do you think will be impacted first, and then the sort of later ones, or how broad will
Right.
this be?
So I think it's very broad. In our work, we found just about every industry has some reasonable level of exposure. It targets like the business backbone in many cases, though like tech and information processing kinds of roles and functions tend to be the most exposed, which incidentally is the most exciting thing I could have seen in the data. Like nothing would make me as hyped up about and stoked for what could happen than to see that all of the researchers, scientists, tech workers, and so on are the most exposed to something that can enhance productivity. We've got enormous headwinds in the economy coming because of demographics for growth, but getting a tool at just the right time that helps us generate, more and better ideas, discover new things, is absolutely great. So, I think a lot of people, especially strangely, sort of finance oriented folks I talk to, tend to think that AI is deflationary. They think it turns to that we turn to automation, it's just a cost reducer and so on. And there are aspects of that in this technology, but the exciting thing is in the complements. It's when you free up a scientist's time, you get rid of a lot of the sort of rote work. What do they focus on? What can they discover in new ways that with these tools that they couldn't find elsewhere? There's work by let's see, a couple papers. One, Jonas Takuri, he's written about how new products get created as a result of new technologies. Use Finnish data, and his co-authors did. And there's a paper by Bettina Fedek and Hodgson about basically the same idea from using a different set of data. So you think about creating new products, whether that's inflationary or deflationary, what that could possibly build. Um, we're talking about like potential transformation in a whole bunch of really interesting ways, and letting knowledge workers do their thing at much higher levels of productivity. That's really, really exciting. And any way you cut it, that's super cool.
Absolutely. And were there any sectors that you were surprised by how they were impacted by AI?
Let me think. Let me. I don't think it, it's hard to say like post hoc, like what I was surprised
Of
by, because
course, yeah.
I'm trying to remember like what my guess would have been. Okay, so here's something that's sort of surprising. We looked at a bunch of the potential impacts for like supervised machine learning, which resembles a much more routine set of capabilities. It's a little bit like old school software where you specify a set of rules to go from input to output, but now we don't have to specify the rules. We just learn the mapping from input to output. Um, so for that one, like it was the lowest wage jobs that were more exposed, like clerical work and that sort of thing. Um, not physical work as much, but with this wave of technologies, it's more the high wage roles that are exposed, and there's still a bit of that clerical exposure too. Now, when I say exposed, I don't mean something like good or bad. I just mean that change is going to happen. And yeah, we found that the tasks where people are paid a lot of money, things like I don't know, pharmacists or lawyers or doctors. There's a lot of places where like generative AI can help there, and supervised machine learning would have a few tasks, where it could help out on the high end of the spectrum. But yeah, I mean, supervised machine learning. My joke was that economists weren't super exposed. We had some tasks we could do, but with generative AI, I mean, I use it every day in what I do. So it's it's a very different kind of animal, and I'm sort of grateful for that. I think it's cool.
Yeah. And so when you talk about AI, its impact, the original work that you did, I mean, did it incorporate generative AI and ChatGPT?
Yeah, so we've run this a couple times. The first
Okay.
paper I worked on for this was more targeted towards supervised machine learning. So this would be um, everything from classification or regression, like ordinary linear regression might even be supervised learning to like um, the first wave of deep learning things. So I did that with Eric Brynjolfsson, Tom Mitchell, more recently with Morgan Frank and the Adron one as well. Um, we uh, we found this pretty robust negative correlation between wages and exposure. And then more recent work with colleagues at OpenAI and Open Research. This is the paper with Tina Alondo, Pamela Mishkin, and Sam Manning. That we call GPTs or GPTs. That is generative pre-trained transformers are general purpose technologies. For this one, we investigate using like the labor market, um, whether or not like that big transformational, huge investment in intangible assets, is that going to be necessary? Is that going to happen? Um, so for that one, we asked a pretty simple question. It's like, could you double your productivity without a drop in quality on this task using generative AI? And the answer is either like, no, you can't, or yes, you can, or like maybe, but probably, but you need additional systems to do it, like more tools, more software, and so on. So by comparing, differences between the yes and the yes and I need to build other systems question, we can see if it satisfies some of the criteria for this like general purpose technology idea. So yeah, I think you kind of have to do this differently every single time you get a new technology wave, because it's weird, right? Like if you had asked me 3 years ago, would we see this kind of advance in unstructured data processing? I would have said probably not. You're kind of nuts if you think that, like, maybe not 3 years ago. When did GPT-2 come out? Whenever, like before that, I said these things are not super great at writing, but now, oh man, there's all sorts of cool things we can do with them. So
And you
yeah.
teach as well, don't you? You teach classes at Wharton as well.
Yes,
Do you
yes.
find your students are using ChatGPT a lot or not?
Oh yeah, I tell them to. If they're not using ChatGPT, hey students, listen, and, use ChatGPT. But I told a few people this. I don't give points like for homeworks, right? For my MBA class, we have a bunch of prompts basically for the homework, and it's based on the reading, and the assignment is easily like facilitated by ChatGPT. But what I said is, yeah, okay, cool. You don't get points for being correct anymore. Um, you get a B if you're correct, and you write 2 pages. You get an A if you're correct and you're original. And what I define originality as in this case is how far away you are from ChatGPT's response. I can also put the answer or the question into ChatGPT and get an answer. So um, I actually use some large language models to analyze what my students say on the responses, and it's pretty clear who created an original response versus who didn't. So I'm still reading these things and grading them myself, in addition to the auto grader. But we don't end up in a world where people pretend to do work and I pretend to grade it. This is
That sounds quite a dystopian world there. I mean, is there
Yeah.
Wharton? Obviously, Wharton's one of the top business schools. I mean, is there a policy that the school has, or is it down to each?
No, I think it's up to
Class?
each teacher. I mean, my attitude is I think these are tools that are here to stay. And if you can trick me and produce original content using GPT, I consider that a valuable skill learned. So, you're threatening me with a good time there as an educator. Um, but yeah, I think the school's been very open to creative uses of the technology. I have other colleagues who are doing really cool things with it. Um, Stay tuned. Maybe this year, I might create chatbots that have each of the syllabus assignments loaded into them with the paper, so you can have a conversation with Hayek or something if you want to ask questions about the paper. I got to figure out the engineering of that, but um, you know, conceptually, it's not that difficult.
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. Now, another area that you've looked at is the geopolitics of AI. There's a lot of talk about increasing tensions between US and China around chip technology, and it does seem like there's this race in AI. How do
Mhm.
you think about something like that?
Well, I think, even outside of the geopolitics, there's just a bottleneck in chips, generally. That's kind of slowing down the development. And it turns out it's just really hard to get the software and hardware integrated, especially at the rate of improvement that's kind of demanded by the market. So NVIDIA is sort of a leader there. Google with their TPUs have done very well as well. I think, yeah, ultimately these models, the sorts of things that are underlying the building blocks are relatively simple, and the models themselves are information goods too. So it's very hard to like limit the spread of knowledge, and people are going to be using AI. And I don't necessarily think it's a good thing to limit the spread of knowledge. I think there's, obviously a lot of brilliant people in China doing research on AI things too. I think they're producing more AI papers in the US even, and um, that mostly will end up being a good thing. You know, Setting aside competitive things, if you're using AI to research healthcare applications, and we find a whole bunch of good ones because the whole world has got access to you know, great research, this is unequivocally helpful for everybody. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that first order thing that, research is generally good for the world. Now, military uses, um, the competitive aspects for how people might use this if they're in power, and there we end up in places where there's more potential for conflict, and that's a little bit worrisome. But um, yeah, I think first order, more research, better research is a good thing for the world. Um,
And so I take it from your answer also that you don't advocate for the pause in AI research.
oh no, absolutely not. I think a pause in AI research would be damaging for no reason. No, I don't find the arguments that we're generating an existential risk to be very convincing. I'm much more worried about misuse. Um, Things like generating fake content and using that to influence elections, or I mean, there are some biotech uses that scare me, but I'm kind of fond of saying that good AI policy is often just good policy. So, you don't necessarily need a law that says don't build a bioweapon with AI. You should probably have a law that says don't build a bioweapon, period. And
Yeah, that makes
that's,
sense.
I think we have those. So, enforcement, monitoring, making sure that we stay on top of things. I kind of trust our future selves with better information to regulate this better. And I also know that there's a ton of research going into what are the best incentive compatible ways to regulate this technology, should those bad outcomes start to show up right now. So I think I'm optimistic, but do I want to slow down the technological development? No, not really. If anything, I'd probably want to accelerate it.
And speaking of acceleration, I mean, what areas of research are you most excited about at the moment?
Oh man, there's so many amazing things. The healthcare applications, I think I'm super psyched about. If there's a place to be pessimistic, it's about how do you integrate healthcare applications into the full healthcare system, because the gains can be very quickly lost. So I think more social science research is needed there to figure out like what's the best way to design healthcare systems. But nevertheless, those applications are super exciting. I think of the physics applications, or I think we've already seen some amazing things like controlling tokamak plasmas with deep reinforcement learning. Like imagining that perhaps with the right data sets, right inputs, we might be able to use some of the more recent unstructured data approaches to discover new things. Super exciting there. Um, Other applications, well, in economics, there's a ton. I saw a really interesting paper presented this year at the NBER Economics of AI conference. It was Sendil Mullainathan is presenting it, and it was using AI to generate hypotheses, to find patterns in the data that we could subsequently go test with more, not correlational but causal methods, to see if they actually, bear fruit. Um, I thought that was not only like an exciting future direction for research, but just super creative, a really cool way to use the technology. So, yeah, I think of this as like just an exciting development in tools, first of all. And then it's like, from tools, what else are you interested in? Because it's all there. There's so many different places to go with it.
That's great.
Yeah.
I did want to round off with a few personal questions. One I always like
Sure.
to ask is, you've been in finance as well as academia. What's the best investment advice that you've ever received?
It's the best if I index funds and forget you on them. I definitely believe that. And I think unless you've got some edge or some reason to think that something the market does not know, which is pretty rare, I would say. That's not necessarily worth acting. So yeah, that's all I do basically is index funds.
Yeah.
Once in a while, I come across something where I'm like, I think I got it. Maybe it's arrogance on my part, but I get a signal where I'm like, I think I know something new now. Like I remember reading an analyst report in 2015 about NVIDIA where they said, yeah, a gaming company can't be worth this much. And I thought, oh my God, they think it's a gaming company. So, yeah, I mean, those sorts of things come across very rarely for me. Now, folks who are trading in the market, I mean, there's all sorts of places where people get information. I mean, in options trading, folks remember this really strange combination of options that traded 3 months ago. And then when someone comes back 3 months later asking for that same weird combination, they're probably taking the position off, right? Like they're not putting more of it on. So those sorts of things, you can definitely find edge if you do your homework, but I don't really spend the time to do it. So all sorts of different things when you're actually trading. I would say read Reminiscences of a Stock Operator by Lefevre, I think.
Yeah, Lefevre. Yeah, Edward Lefevre. Yeah. That's definitely a good book. Yeah.
That thing's still got anything there is to learn about trading, I think is still in that book.
Yeah. And we do have some younger people listening to the podcast as well. Some of them are at college; they're going to leave college soon, to enter the real world, the jobs market. What advice would you give them?
So a few things. One, you seek feedback. I think one of the differences between the educational context and like the real world is, people like managers are not always going to tell you how you're doing. You're not going to get grades. You have to figure out how to do your job well, you kind of on your own. So, ask people, what can you do differently? And then when they tell you, act on it. You're responsible for that information. So that's one thing, I did that early in my career. And it helped me. It also was a bit of a rude awakening sometimes, when I asked. Sometimes you find out things you didn't want to find out. But, it's worth doing. Another is be prepared for things to change. I think, there can be very, I'm trying to put this in a kind way. Employers' sense of loyalty is contingent on a business environment in many cases. And as great as things might be, you might need to plan for not great things, but sometimes as well, turbulence can lead to kind of upward direction. So if you see opportunities, don't be afraid to push for them. But if things aren't going great for your company, you should understand the kinds of incentives that your employer is facing too. It sounds cynical, but I think it's useful for younger people to understand that they need to be able to take risk in their stage in their career.
Yeah, that's great piece of advice there. Last question I wanted to ask you was, what are some of the books that have really influenced you over your career?
Oh, sure. Well, the Reminiscences of a Stock Operator was one, and then when I was a trader, the Natenberg book, Options and what's it called? Options and Futures Trading. I forget. There's a whole bunch of. It's embarrassing that I can't remember the title of the book.
Was that the whole book? Options, Futures. That one.
Oh, Options and Other Derivatives. Yeah, the whole book's good. But it's the Natenberg book.
Natenberg. Okay.
Yeah, it's a green book, and I'm forgetting the.
Okay, no,
So
that's fine. I'll look it up and I'll add it to the show notes.
yeah, that was really helpful. In terms of other books, from the trading perspective, Against the Gods, The Remarkable Story of Risk was a good one. Fortune's Formula as well. And then the Long-Term Capital Management book.
Was it When Geniuses Fail? Was that
When Genius Failed? Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good
Yeah.
one.
So those, I thought those were all great. They're great finance books. On the other hand, I tend to read for fiction a bunch of sci-fi, and
Okay.
just to get to think about what things look like in a different environment, right? So a good amount of, I think, looking forward, trying to plan differently, or trying to think about what's an interesting question. I think sci-fi people tend to help you, sort of confabulate in your own head about what scenarios might, show up. So if I love the Three Body Problem trilogy. So especially the second one, The Dark Forest. Nexus, the Nexus series, that's a very fast-paced book, and I think some of the characters, how they react to things, are incredibly foolish. And
makes for a fun story though.
It's a wonderful story.
I mean, Three Body Problem, that's quite hard sci-fi as well.
Yeah, I suppose.
As in
yeah,
real physics in there. So, well, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just a certain, you combine that with certain nonfiction books. I think Thinking Strategically is a good book as well. Economics is a little bit of a poison of a discipline in a way. Not to be negative about it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it, and then it's like a lens with which to view the world. So, I think you attribute people's best intentions to their actions, but there's also on average, there's things that might be a little bit more predictable. I don't know. I feel like
that's
my
a good
typical
selection
readings
of books there.
Yeah, the other stuff I read are I don't know, Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy.
Okay.
I'm not sure that has a ton of influence for how I think about things.
Nice gritty book to read.
Yeah, I was reading that on the beach, listening to the latest Tool album, a year or two ago, and I was like, "This is one of the more intense experiences I've had."
I can imagine. Not the most obvious beach reading, I would say, or listening.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I did also want to ask you. I mean, what's the best way for people to follow your research?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm on Twitter or X or whatever we're going to be calling it. That's just my name, Daniel Rocca. I'll post things on my website. Trying to think what else. Yeah, I mean, just shoot me an email if you're curious too. I'm around. I'm happy to chat with folks if they're curious.
Okay, great. Now I'll add the Twitter account and your personal site on the show notes as well. So sure. with that, thanks a lot, and keep up the great research work, by the way. And
thanks so much. Yeah, and keep up the great podcast work. It's quite an exciting slate of folks you talk to. I'm honored to be part of that number now.
That's great. I appreciate that.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.